Socialism, communism, fascism, words we hear more and more that are thrown around a lot, but what do they really mean? To be better informed is the best way to have more productive social debates, and it is also the best way to protect ourselves from disinformation. Words have meaning, and it's important to understand what they mean. And you will see socialism is way less scary than what some people might want you to think. In today's episode, our expert, thanks to his extensive experience and many scientific research, will explain these concepts and more. Without further ado, let's learn stress-free with Érick Duchesne from Laval University. Hi, Érick.
Hello, Jeff.
Thanks very much for joining us today. Before we dive into science, I like to know my guests. And since no one knows you better than yourself, I'd like you to introduce yourself to our audience. What brought you here, your field of research. So talk to us about you.
Well, likewise, thank you very much for your invitation, Jeff. I'm delighted to be here. I love the concept of your podcast. We both share the same conviction. Knowledge should be accessible to everyone. Not turning to myself, I'm a full professor in the Department of Political Science at Laval. Where I taught for more than 20 years after initiating my career south of the border in the United States. My main field of research is IP, which we call International Political Economy, which means that I study relations between states, international trade, economic negotiations, power relations, and for several years now, have also specialized in American politics. Now, if I go back a little bit, what led me to this career was not only, say, interest in politics. Would say it was almost an insatiable curiosity to understand why the world works the way it does. Very early on, I realized that beyond major international events, there were institutions, rules, power relations, political choices that could be analyzed rather than simply endured. I think in the current moment, I think that takes all of its sense. So I always enjoyed research, but I think what I'm the most passionate about now, nearing the end of my, say, official career, is the transmission of knowledge. I taught thousands of students. I had the privilege of training Canadian diplomats. And for several years now, I've been also a regular media commentator. More recently, I launched a blog because I wanted to step back a little more than media interviews, usually allow and explain international issues with more context and nuance. So I think that's exactly what we're doing today. Demonstrate that a democracy works much better when students understand the concepts on which the public debates rest. As you mentioned so well, we constantly hear words such as democracy, populism, fascism, socialism, capitalism, and so on. Now, those are all words that are often used as slogans, labels, even though they have a more precise meaning. So, conclusion, I would say, basically understanding politics does not have to be stressful. Once we understand the basic concepts, we realize that the world is complex, but obviously much less mysterious. So I often tell my students that political science does not exist to tell us what to think. It exists to help us think better. And I believe this is more important than ever in today's world. And yet again, this is why I want to be grateful for your invitation, because that's really, we're really going that directions, and hopefully this podcast will be useful to many.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words. And I'll put the link to your blog also in the episode description. So, for our listeners, if you want to know
Perfect.
more or keep yourself up to date, because we won't have the luxury to have maybe a weekly podcast about the subject, but people will be able to be informed and more up to date on what's happening through your blog. So, to start the episode, because you mentioned a few words, and one of the reasons for this episode is to clarify what those words mean, I'd like you to explain what are the main democratic systems and economic systems, and how we distinguish between a democratic system and an economic system. And after that, we can explain these different systems in more detail so we can fully understand them and clearly distinguish between them.
That sounds great. I think that's the crucial question. So to begin, we need to make a very important point, important distinctions that people often mix up. That is the difference between a democratic system and an economic system. And it's pretty simple. When you think of a democratic system or political system in general, answers are they answer a simple question: who holds the power, and how are decisions made? It's as simple as that. If we think about economic system, that answers another questions, similar in parallel. Say, how does a society produce and distribute wealth? There are two different dimensions, which means that a country can be democratic or not, while also having different types of economic organization. So on the side of democratic and political system, we can identify a few broad models. First, there is, as we have here in Canada, Western Europe, we can, dispute the case, that's still the case in the US, is a liberal democracy, which means with free elections and protected rights. There are also authoritarian regimes where power is concentrated and elections are limited or absent. But more generally, we're kind of sometimes we're in between the two. Some speak of hybrid or illiberal regimes. Now, we talk about illiberal regimes. Now, the main reference was Orban in Hungary. Is that more and more the case in the US? Well, we can turn to that a little later if you want, which means that there are elections, but institutions are more fragile. On the side of economic system, there are also few broad models. The most widespread today is what we call the market economy, often called capitalism. Sometimes, we use both terms. It's not exactly the same thing, but very often we use both terms, which means that private firms and markets play a central role. At the other extreme, there's the planned economy, which is historically associated with communism, where the state largely organizes production. So between the two, we find mixed economy. The market dominates, but the state intervenes to regulate the economy, provide social programs. This is the case for most developed countries, including Canada. What is important to understand here is that political systems and economic systems are not necessarily the same thing. A democracy can have more or less state intervention in the economy, like, for instance, more interventions in Canada. Sometimes we refer to Canada as a welfare state than nowadays in the United States. But at the same time, an authoritarian regime can also have a very capitalist economy. And here we can think about, especially in terms of its opening the rest of the world, we can think about China. China, sometimes I tell my listeners or my students, seems like, Chinese are more capitalist than Americans themselves. So that's why, to understand a country, we always need to look at the two dimensions separately. The political system on one side, the economic system on the other. So I think a few clarifications from the get-go, I think were necessary here.
But that's interesting because you mentioned, and I really feel in the public discourse that people tend to basically put those in a bundle. Like if there was only one kind of configuration, but what you're telling us is basically you have the political system is one thing, the economical system is another thing. You can have different combination of both, and
Yeah,
to really understand a country, you need to basically analyze on both axes.
yeah. Which at first, bright brush, it's not necessarily so far from reality. But we all gain by getting a little bit more, uh, deeper into those differences.
And you mentioned I won't go back through them in alphabetic order for
Yeah.
sure. But one thing that you mentioned also, and we hear this word so much, and I feel like you mentioned in your introduction, it's labels and it's I don't know, like sound bites or whatever. But I think we really need to start with that. Let's clarify for our audience in practical term, what is socialism? How does it work?
Oh, yeah. It's really, that's probably one of the most misunderstood words today. It's mentioned so well, it's often used as a negative label, especially in the United States. Think about the Trump regimes when they refer to Canada. It's we're a socialist country, but concretely, it's fairly simple. It's a simple idea that the market should not decide everything. No, it's not all economy. The laissez-faire, the invisible hand. So market should not decide everything, and that society should intervene to reduce economic inequality. It's as simple of that. It starts from an observation. If we let the market operate on its own, there can be major inequalities in wealth and in access to essential services such as healthcare and education. Socialism, therefore, proposes that the community, often through the state itself, play an important role in correcting these inequalities.
So, from what I understand, it's basically we don't want to focus the wealth only in the hands of a few people because right now I think worldwide it's like 8 people who owns as much wealth as the 50%, half the
Yeah,
world's
yeah.
population. And you mentioned two things: education and healthcare, which are very important to have a healthy and thriving society. So basically, socialism is through different means to make sure that this wealth disparity doesn't get out of hand and that we're able to redistribute so that the population still have access to quality services.
Yeah, so then that's right. But sometimes it doesn't mean that everything has to go through the state and perfect redistribution because without that, you wouldn't have innovation accumulation. We want to have innovators to have having some profits from their innovations and taking risk on that. We want that, but obviously there has to be something at least to have a bare minimum, or in more advanced countries, more than a bare minimum for all. So what people do not always realize that socialism is not one single thing. There's a whole range of approaches. At one end, and that's probably not what we would want, even here in Canada, for instance, there are more radical forms in which state controls as a large part of the economy. But in today's reality, the most common form is what we call social democracy. So here, it's interesting. We mix the democracy with some type of a of markets. That's where you have political system and economic system kind of mixing together through social democracy. Which means that the market economy continues to exist. Innovators can keep creating for the good, the well-being of society, but with more important social programs and rules to limit inequality. So, for instance, clear example, programs such as public health insurance, old age pensions, unemployment insurance. are often inspired by socialist idea, uh, in the sense that they aim to protect citizens against economic risk and shocks. Uh, does not mean that these countries are no longer capitalist. Canada, France, Sweden, we'll talk a lot about the northern European country. They remain market economies, but where the vast majority of firms are private, but there's still this safety net. So we have it's important questions because there are some false beliefs. Socialism wants to abolish the market. That's not true. The widespread idea is that, eliminating the market of private property. In reality, most modern forms of socialism, even in the United States, maybe to a lesser degree than Canada, accept that there is those safety nets, but at the same time, the market economy, they seek to instead correct it. Sometimes imperfectly, sometimes better than others, but that's how things move. So Canada is not socialist, despite what Mr. Trump might say. The president of the United States. In Canada is truly a market economy with strong social program. So that's not the same thing. Socialism is not communism either. Uh,
But that's actually it's my next question. But I want to jump
yeah,
in on socialism because
yeah,
I'm listening to you explain what socialism is, and I'm pretty sure our listeners are like, oh, but that's amazing, right? Less wealth inequalities, better social systems, better social support in case of you mentioned such as unemployment benefits, healthcare benefits. So I really feel that but no, because I don't involve myself in that, but that socialism has been wrapped. Basically, it's how they address the boogeyman. I
that's right.
feel.
That's right. And more than ever now, we've seen as recently as this week some gains by the socialist fringe of the Democratic Party, including in very important election in Michigan. And more, the Republicans are labeling the Democrats as communists. They're using this negative label to represent them. Um, so I think it's important uh, to be a bit more clear about what is communism. Communism in itself, when we look at it literally, is not a bad thing. There shouldn't be a bad label on it. In practice, that's a different thing. So let's get to that. So,
Yeah, because
uh,
you put an interesting point there because
yeah,
from what I understand, and that's one of the reasons why you're there is to make sure I also understand things properly, is communism on paper is the best system. But now there's this thing called human nature that comes into play that kind of changes what communism basically how it's been conceived and conceptualized versus how it's applied nowadays. Because I feel it's also another because you mentioned wealth inequality, and in one other episode for our listeners, if you want to go listen to episode 3, my guest mentioned that there were some studies that were made and that people are comfortable with a ratio of 1 to 5. So basically, the most paid people in society, if they make 5 times what the less paid people in society make, like that ratio, people are comfortable with it. Well, now we see thousands to one.
oh yeah,
That's
yeah,
that we're not on the same. We're not even in the same universe of wealth inequalities.
yeah,
So, what is communism on paper,
yeah,
and
yeah,
also how it differentiates basically from
yeah.
socialism?
No, obviously, in terms of labels, when we think about communist Soviet Union and all that, so we'll turn to that. But communism is much more precise idea than socialism. And, the two can be confused. Uh, but if we take it in its classical definition, communism is a form of economic and social system that aims for a society without social classes and without private ownership of the means of production, where resources belong collectively to society. That would be, marvelous if we could get there. Maybe some, who knows? But that sounds really good on paper. means that the ultimate goal of communism is a society where wealth is shared according to needs rather than according to the ability to pay. So, in theory, communism is therefore a very ambitious project. It aims for an egalitarian society where major economic inequalities disappear and economic exploitation no longer exists. But that's a theoretical communism. In reality, we need to understand really things really work when with those countries when they have exercise some forms of communism. In classical theory, communism was supposed, as I said, to lead to a society where the state itself would eventually fade away, wither away. In historical practice, what we saw instead was the contrary, where very powerful states controlling a large part of the economy and society, completely at the opposite. The idea is that we don't need any more states. We live in the perfect. No, it's contrary. It is the heavy hand of the states that we see in reality. So I understand very well why some people find the idea of communism attractive in a theory because it proposes a very egalitarian society. But what we observe historically is that the transition from theory to practice has proven extremely difficult. I'll mention countries as Soviet Union or even China. They claim to be communist, but they never reach communism as it is defined in theory. They were, think about in terms of China, they are highly planned economies governed by centralized states. In China, those are 5-year plans. We're going to plan for the next 5 years. They make goals, and it is the heavy hand of the states that redistribute well. So we can say that communism, in the theoretical sense, a society with classes and without private property has never, and I don't think it will ever either, really exist at the scale of a country.
That's
So,
two things you mentioned that are very interesting. So you say communism, as it was defined, never existed.
Never.
Or maybe, I guess, maybe if we go back all the way to when we live in caves, maybe
Oh,
then.
yeah, well.
Maybe. But like in recent documented history, communism, this big boogeyman word that is used, has never. So I think it's very important to repeat for people. Communism,
Yeah.
as it was conceived and conceptualized, never existed.
Yeah, never existed, I would say, in the industrial, since the
Industrial revolution and the
industrial
last of
revolution.
his.
That's the word. So no, maybe yeah, in some small societies and that, yes, maybe, but that's not what we're talking about.
Because we
That
talk
would
about
be
boogeyman.
completely different subject.
Boogeyman, the purpose of a boogeyman is to scare people.
Well,
And
yeah.
you say communism is a system with no social class and no wealth inequalities. And you mentioned two words that I mentioned: economical exploitation. So you said in communism, as it was defined and conceptualized, those things do not exist. Social classes do not exist. Economical exploitation doesn't exist. So maybe I'm going to put my tinfoil hat for a few seconds, but maybe that's why the wealthy wants us to be so scared of communism, because their power over us will then be non-existent.
Yeah,
in a fictional world where we manage to make this work.
But the thing is, terms maybe in some ancestral societies, recent development, but in all the cases, more recent cases when there was some communism, at the start, you needed a strong state to instill communism. So this idea, well, you have a strong state, we're going to instill communism, and then ultimately everyone will be equal. We won't need any states. That doesn't make any sense. At the same time, it's not just we start with socialism, a socialist system, and then we're going to have a stronger version of socialism going towards communism. That's what the Republicans in the United States would like us to believe, would like their voters to believe that, with electing people like Mamdani in New York and all that, when you start with socialism, and that's going to then go towards communism. That never happened, and that's not going to happen. So
But
that
even if
has to
it
be.
does, I mean, even if it does, the way you're telling it is everyone has what they need in communism. So even air quotes here, worst comes to worst, and the country becomes a communist country, by definition, that means that no more social classes, no more economical exploitation, and people have what they need. I don't see this as a bad pitch. I see this as a very good pitch.
Yeah, that's a good pitch. You go with that pitch, but I don't even think that the so-called those who are now liberally calling themselves socialists at the United States, it's clear that that aim is not to transform the United States into a communist country. What they aim for is get maybe closer to social democracy, such as Canada, some kind of welfare states, or Northern Europe, but definitely not. They're not aiming for communism. It wouldn't make any sense. Uh, that's because all communist countries, even then, they're not uh, identical. There are different models. You can see some models with very strong authoritarian states where we were in the Soviet Union, softer version with China right now. Uh, but at the same time, communism, I would say, it would be wrong to think that communism still exists today. Every country governed by communist parties widely use market mechanism. The best example, of course, I was referring to China. Yes, it is led by Communist Party, but its economy functions largely as a market economy.
So
Well,
you mentioned label earlier on. It's like I drive a Kia, right? But
yeah.
if I put a Ferrari sticker on my Kia and I call it a Ferrari, it's still just a Kia.
Well, it depends.
So it's
If
basically, so
Yeah,
people will label things calling them a thing, but when you look at the thing, it's not what they're labeled it as.
yeah. Well, no. We will turn to that a little later, talking about political communications. But let's say you're the president of the United States, and you label your Kia a Ferrari. All the mega troops are going to say, yeah, 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 of course, yeah, that's a great Ferrari, and red, and even more. That's the best Ferrari I've ever seen. So, you know, uh, the U.S. president's rhetoric on communism is strong. Uh, the rhetoric matter in this case, with the emergent figures as Zoran Mamdani, as mayor of New York, as I said, and you certainly notice that because I know you follow U.S. politics.
Too much for my
Uh,
mental health.
no,
Definitely
I
too much for
know,
my mental health.
I know, but same here, if I can say. But uh, the president of the United States mainly denounced socialism now 4 years. In recent weeks, or months, couple of months, he has increasingly spoken of communism, going so far as to describe some Democratic candidate as communist. So the shift here is not trivial. Words matter. Uh, but once we understand what is really what those systems represent, we can say we can call the BS, right? We can say, well, it's all bullshit. Uh, so can only hope that more and more Americans recognize that. But it's a very, very heavy word. When we say communism instead of socialism, it evokes the Cold War, evokes the Soviet Union, presents them as an adversary than what was seen, when the confrontation was seen as existential. So it's sending the message, if you elect those communists, we're going to become like the Soviet Union in the Cold War.
That's interesting what you're mentioning. So, because if we look at the history of the United States, communist has always been pretty much the enemy, right? And
Yeah.
so And so tagging Democrat candidates as communists, it basically sends them, and it might be weird for people outside of the USA who might be listening. It's like, but we know it's not the case, but we need to go back. Like if you spent your whole life in the US and you look at the history of the country, and so labeling, because you said it's not trivial, the shift from socialism to communist, because I mean, in New York, there are very nice things happening right now. So they had to shift the rhetoric to keep people scared a little bit. And so that word then communists and identifying political opponents as communists is basically a way to make people think that those people would be like the enemy of the state almost.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically the enemy within. So the deep state has become the communist. And that's a strong message to at least a fair portion of the US electorate. And that's not, so that's, and we'll see. In the midterm elections, is that going to be
If there is
something
even
that
an midterm
affect?
election, I'm starting to
Yeah,
have my
well,
doubts, but yeah.
that's so that will be an entirely different podcast. But
Yeah.
yeah, if there is, but so we may agree or disagree with the proposals of the what I would call the democratic socialists, but calling them communists blurs the analytical categories. That's precisely where what we're trying to avoid today, using the right words to talk about the right realities. So in politics, words do not only describe reality, they also help construct a narrative. And that's what the Republicans are trying to construct. Well, that's the essence of politics, right? You're going to try to label, your the other parties, and with language as strong as saying that's the enemy within. So if I summarize very simply, socialism means mainly seeks to reduce inequalities in an economy that can remain largely private. So it's trying to find the right balance. Communism aims for a society in which private ownerships of the means of production disappears. But now that's in theory. In reality, uh, now whether communism has ever existed as defined in theory, at least in since the industrial revolutions, as you said so well, my most honest answer to that is no. Now we've seen attempts at communist society, but not as fully realized communist society. Communism has existed mainly as a political project and historical experiment. And I wouldn't even say genuine. I think it was just a way of seizing power, much more than as a fully realized system. So, one reason communism remains debated today is because of rhetoric. That's because theory and practice have been indeed very different.
So you mentioned, because you mentioned there's like, so capitalism, as we call, sometimes is what we call a market economy. And
Hmm.
from what I understand, there seems to be like a continuum. Like there's different levels of capitalism. So for us, we're in Canada,
Hmm.
North America, and if I'm not mistaken, North America, well, Canada, US, Mexico, we operate under a capitalist system. But there seems to be different levels of capitalism, because I get the impression that we've reached an extreme level of wealth concentration and that capitalism is approaching the limits of its viability, what some people call late stage capitalism, right? There's a limit to stretch an elastic. Eventually, it's going to snap in your face. And I feel that we might be reaching that point. So basically, you see, capitalism is not, it doesn't have to be all five people control everything. It can be, they can be basically
Yeah,
different degrees.
yeah. I guess we can turn to that a little later, but that's when you get into those extremes that uh, you see the rise of populism as well. But we can turn to that a little later if you want. But
Yeah,
you're
I have a
right.
question on populism.
Yeah. So indeed, there are different forms of capitalism. Least extreme to even as I said, in a liberal democracy, in a welfare state, you have some forms of capitalism. Capitalism only mean is that you have some society, some firms, some individuals that are accumulating capital. It used to be gold. It used to be silver. And then you can use that. Obviously, you could, buy a biggest yacht if you want, one more Ferrari, or you can reinvest in society. That's the idea behind that. Uh, so yes, Canada, North America, and the United States clearly operate within a capitalist economy, as I have just described it. Now, the sense is true that private firms, markets, private investment plays a central role in the economy. But it's very important to understand that capitalism almost never exists in a pure form either. In reality, there are different forms and degree of capitalism. Now, for instance, capitalism in the United States is generally more market oriented, with less state intervention in certain area. We can think about, think back, uh, Ronald Reagan, which says, well, if the states intervenes less and less, we have more accumulation of capital, and then, it's just going to then flow back to the entire society with more, but that's not exactly what we've seen. Seeing that more and more the capitals are held in terms of dividends in the hands of investors and not solely to the entire U.S. society. In Canada and Europe, we find more regulated forms of capitalism with more social programs and protections. I'm not saying no, it's uh, for when there are free elections, it's for the people to decide. But sometimes when but I think in the United States, we're in a system where the people really decide when they have some electoral rules where one individual, let's say Elon Musk, can spend hundreds of millions on a single election. So that brings some important question mark. But it's just example to show that there are degrees of capitalism. As I said, capitalism exists even in China. Uh, so you're absolutely right. It's not a null or nothing questions. And that's if we can bring those type of nuance to your listener, that's very important. We can imagine capitalism as a continuum. At one end, we find very, very lightly regulated capitalism. And that's the way that the Republican Party seems to be going in that direction, where the market plays almost the entire role. At the other end, we find economies where the market still exists, but where the state intervened more to redistribute wealth and regulate the economy, such as countries in Northern Europe. And somewhere in between, you would find Canada. Uh, just maybe a little word on what we can call late stage capitalism. Now, sometimes we hear that expression. Uh, it's an expression that's often used to express discomfort with certain developments in capitalism. You mentioned like for instance, the CEO. Most CEOs of big companies, being in Canada, the US, maybe it's worse in the US, we'd say, well, uh, we always hear that in early January. It's January 3rd. And so the CEOs of the 500 big companies have reached the salaries of their workers after only 3 days. So we think about here concentration of wealth, of the power of large corporations. So there's a reason why that there's discomfort about sometimes it could be late to free trade, free trade of the free flow of goods and this accumulation of power. That's why there's some kind of setback against that. That's why you have those candidates in the United States called themselves socialists, seems to be doing fairly well. Uh, it's not a precise scientific concept, but it's a critical expression used in public debate. This late stage capitalism that I think we can link to there's always a pendulum swing. There's this pendulum swing going with the rise, I would say, of the socialist candidates and at the same time, the rise of populism. So the big question is, talk about pendulum, has this has capitalism reached its limit? Uh, It's true that many researchers, maybe myself included, are concerned about certain trends. Now, rising inequality, concentration of economic power. But I would say, if I want still remain optimistic, capitalism has shown a strong capacity for adaptation. It has evolved several times. Think about the Gilded Age, in the late 19th century, uh, but has been followed by creation of social programs in the 20th century. Uh, and when needed, even the regulation of the financial markets. So today's capitalism is not the same as capitalism of 100 years ago. It will probably continue to evolve. Canada, think about here in Canada, Canada remains clearly a capitalist economy, but a capitalist economy with important social programs, state intervention in certain areas, especially think about here in Canada. To give you direct answer, say we're still in a capitalist system, in a form capitalism that takes different shapes depending on countries and periods. So I would say the real debate today is not really whether we live in capitalism, it is rather what kind of capitalism we want. And that's for the electorate to decide. Economic systems generally do not stop abruptly, they just transform gradually.
So you mentioned the electorate, and basically it's a good segue also because you mentioned people such as Musk who spend hundreds of millions of dollars on
Yeah,
election, and it can affect. I feel we already seen it, but it can have an
yeah,
impact on democracy. And my next question is, what are let's talk about the democratic systems, and let's start
yeah.
on a positive note, if I may. What is a democracy?
But in this, its most simplest sense, can define it in one sentence. It's a political system in which power comes from the citizens. That's well, um, that's a cliff note answer.
Okay.
Uh, Now, if we dig a little deeper, concretely, that means that the leaders are chosen through free, regular elections. Citizens can replace their governments without violence.
Oh,
Uh,
that's important words. Without violence.
Without violence. But of course, democracy is not just about elections. For a system to be truly democratic, there must also be clear rules of the game. We understand the rules of the game. We respect the games. That's what we call the rule of law. It means that governments must respect the law just like citizens do. The law is not there just for citizens, they're there for the governments to respect as well.
So in a healthy democracy, when you lose the election, you take your bags and you go home. You
Yes,
don't
yes,
complain for years that you was stolen, and you don't
yes.
send
Well,
people attacking. So
let's take a very good recent examples, and more power to him, is Edmund Orban in Hungary. It was extremely powerful. Lost the elections. We haven't heard anything from him. He said, well, okay, that's fine. I'm moving on. Maybe he'll return later, but who knows? But he did respect. That's, I want to say more power to him. I'm not going to refer to another individual not too far from Canada, but,
yeah,
you know what I'm talking
yeah,
about.
yeah.
So, but that's not, but even there, it's not just we have free, fair elections, we respect the results. It's not enough. There are also fundamental freedoms of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association. So citizens can debate, organize politically. So, three simple pillars. We can summarize democracy around three essential elements. As I said, first, of course, free and competitive elections. Second, protected rights and freedom. And third, institutions that limit the powers of the leader.
It's funny you mentioned that because we heard, I think it's this week, I think it's a senator that said, well, we can't rein in the president's power. It's like,
Well,
ain't that your
that's
job? That the reason you exist to rein in the
that's right.
president's power? They
That's
say, oh, well,
right.
we can't do that. Okay, well
That's
then,
why.
why are we
That's
paying
what.
you?
No, that's why. That's why we are so concerned. I would say, as we think, Congress has not been playing its role very well. I'm a bit more pessimistic about the Supreme Court, but so that can be debated. But I think the Supreme Court, we would probably need to devote an entire, podcast to that. But still, despite the fact it's extremely with a 6-3 conservative majority, I think there's still some balance there. Uh, so just to be clear, a democracy is not only about voting; it's about being able to choose freely and replace those who govern. It's also important to understand that democracy is a political system. It's not an economic system. Now we're really talking about, deciding who governs. I don't know if you can see it behind me, but I have that, book by David Easton called Who Govern. It's a classical. A democracy can have more or less state intervention in the economy. That would be, some kind of economic matter, but that does not change its democratic character. So in practice, thing, we're not perfect, far from perfect. There's no perfect system, but Canada is a good example of democracy. Governments are elected, elections are competitive, and citizens can freely criticize their leaders, which we do regularly.
And what I like also about Canada versus, because I've been following, like I said, I've been following the American political for like maybe 10, 12 years. And my head hurts when I try to understand their voting system. In Canada, it's so easy to vote. It's
Yeah,
so easy to vote. And I think in a healthy democracy, it should be easy to vote. You shouldn't have to jump through
yeah,
hoops and, so like, I don't know, sacrifice one of your ancestors or whatever. It's just you receive a paper from the mail, you make sure the information is
yeah,
okay. You have a bunch of days. In our laws, employers have to free you. They have to allow you to have enough free time during election day to be able. It's in the law.
yeah. Well, I think that's a bit what I was going next. So in a nutshell, here in Canada, I don't have any parties that say we're going to do everything that we can to restrict the vote, which is not the case of the Republican Party south of the border, including the President of the United States. Uh, that's a key difference. I think that, but I keep repeating is that uh, it's not all of the questions because in a country like the United States, institutionally, they have a lot more safeguards against, those type of voting restrictions or concentration of powers. Much more in the United States than we have here in Canada. We have a more fragile democracy. So maybe there's something societal behind that, saying we're not like the United States, but we are at risk. So if we love democracy, we need to share it. It's like a pearl. We need to polish it constantly, and that's really a key distinction here. But not all democracies function exactly the same way. That's the message that I want your listener to understand. It's not a permanent state. It's an equilibrium that must be constantly maintained. What we're seeing in the United States right now, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't think it could come to that.
Oh, you would
So
have been brought probably to a nut house. Like if you said,
yeah,
if someone said this is what's coming, the person would have been institutionalized
no,
for
that's
sure,
right.
for sure.
That's right. So democratic institutions can strengthen, they can also weaken when the rules of the games are gradually called into question. So in the United States, mentioned so well, uh, can say some would debate that it still remains a democracy, although a more fragile democracy. Elections are still more or less competitive, would say more competitive than not. Now we're talking about, as you said, if there are some midterms elections, there's a great chance that the Democrats will make some very important gains. The courts continue to exercise some oversight. We see all the challenge by Donald Trump, those close to him, to the 2020 elections. In every instances that they were overruled by the courts. There's still some oversight of the executive power. Citizens can still choose their leaders, obviously with new rules being put in place, harder for some than others. But in policy, we would therefore not say that the United States has ceased to be a democracy.
And
What?
one that's doing an amazing work also, and I'll plug him because I follow him a lot, and
Yeah,
he's amazing. Is Mark Eliash from Democracy Docket.
yeah.
So if anyone, like if you're not aware of who he is and the work that he's done, he's been fighting a lot on the good side of history and the good side of democracy also, and he has his YouTube channel and everything. So I strongly recommend, if you're into American politics, Mark Eliash is definitely someone you want to be following.
That's a great example. I would say I think he's a bit more preoccupied by the state of U.S. democracy. Timothy Snyder would be someone else. I would say your listeners should follow.
You mentioned earlier with the rise of capitalism and all that, also populism, because that's another word we hear a lot, populism, and we hear it thrown in different kind of contexts and to different political leaders. But first of all, in practical term, what is populism? And can you give us some current or recent examples without getting yourself in trouble?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Before I turn to populism, because it's really tied into this idea of free elections and the election system, and I think without getting too much in trouble, but let's stay a little bit on the U.S. On the U.S. case, because what we're seeing in the U.S. is really it's not the end of the democracy. I'm really optimistic, but those are signs of democratic erosions. And they can take different forms, and that's linked. Let's see, and everything is saying it's kind of linked to popularism. You're gonna see the link here. Extreme polarization. It's clear. Questioning the legitimacy of elections. Attempts to change electoral rules to the advantage of one party. Greater concentration of executive power. Pressure on certain independent institutions. So, in the current context, several researchers believe that the Trump regime and part of the Republican Party are seeking to create more favorable conditions ahead of the next midterm elections. So the debate is less about whether American democracies exist and more about its quality, its capacity over time to guarantee fully free and fair political competition. So just to conclude on that, democracy, it's not a binary category. It's not one or the other. That's precisely why political scientists are less interested in labels and in trajectories. Now, what are the trajectories? And one of the trajectory that we've seen, not only in the United States, is this rise of populism. Rise of populism is because of insatisfaction with the system. As much as we have we just related to economic system and the political system. So populism, as you said, obviously we hear a lot about populism today. And again, we use it too vaguely, if you ask me. But I would say in its simplest definition, and that's why I wanted to put that in link with what's going with the elections in the United States, is that populism is a way of doing politics that opposes the people, now thus the term populism, to the elites. So populism claims that society is divided between, on the one side, and if you look at my fingers here, the real people.
Air quotes,
Air
the real
quotes,
people
right?
versus
Right. And on the other, political, economic, or media elites who are supposedly disconnected from reality. That's the essence of populism. So what's important to understand is that populism is not in itself a complete of economic political ideology. So there have been some parties in Israel call themselves populist party. It was just a label. But it's not a party. It's not necessarily ideology. It shows some discontent. We can find, now we think that populist movements are on the left. But now think about the rise of Donald Trump, you see that populism is also on the right. So it's more of a political style or way of framing issues.
So basically, it's how you wrap the message. So imagine
You
like
wrap the
the box,
message.
the message is the box, the politic is the box. So the wrapping could be populism, the us
That's
versus them. We have to
that's
tackle the
right.
elite. We have
That's
to,
right.
but it doesn't tell you anything about what's in the box.
That's right. It's
So the populism
always
message is the wrapping that makes the bus attractive, so that you
yeah.
want to see what's inside, but then you might have surprises that you might not like.
That is right. That is right. It's always inscribed in this idea of us, the people, versus them, the elite.
So basically, we can say Obama's campaign was a little bit wrapped like this because
Yes. Yes.
we was us, was
Yes.
the people, we
Yes.
can make things better, we can make changes, we can. But then again,
That's
it's
right.
not what's in the box is not the same thing as another political figure in the States that also use a us versus them that criticize the elite, but every picture you see of him is surrounded with the elite.
Yeah, you are right. It is that's a great example. It's not just Donald Trump, I think and that's with the election of Obama created the spark for the rise of the MAGA populism. And that's a message that, that's I think it's important to convey. So populism, I think you made some good reference here, emphasizes few recurring ideas. It's the idea that the people must take back control. Yes, we can. There's some distrust toward institutions. Things that went that got away from us. This has to be, talking about the deep state, for instance. Leadership that is often highly personalized around a political figure. Obama was an important political figure. Trump is an important political figure. You would hardly find, sometimes it's hard to have it needs a strong man or strong woman to convey this message. Populism is not going to have much hold if it's not around a very important political figure. So that's important. Those are the key. What it's not, as I said, can be on the right, can be on the left. It's not fascism either. Now, it's a frequent confusion to conflate populism and fascism. So, I know a lot of people don't like the US president, as much as Trump would label the socialist candidate as being communist, the other way you would have, we would call Trump a fascist. That's disputable. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But populism is not fascism. Populism can exist within a democracy without necessarily making it disappear. Another point that I think that is important, populism is not necessarily ignorance. When Trump says, well, those ignorant, those are my people, right? That was part of the rhetoric, right? Anti-intellectualism. I don't think you need to be ignorant and know nothing about politics and you can be manipulated easily. No, I think it's the basis on a strong resentment. It's not necessarily ignorance. People in their day-to-day life, they feel like slighted by the system. It does not necessarily come from a lack of education or information. It often reflects real concerns, for example, about economic changes or, towards globalization. True or false, but that's the way that people feel it. That's a strong feeling. That's their feeling. So at the same time, it's not necessarily extremism. Not all populist movements are extreme. Some can participate fully in the democratic game. And I think that's what, with the rise of the socialist candidate in the United States, I think they want to participate fully in the democracy. And I'm not ready to call them communists, as Trump would say. I think doesn't have to fall into the extreme. We can observe populist movement in several regions of the world today. Some movements in Europe emphasize national sovereignty, criticism of political elite. Now, think about France Insoumise, for instance. Uh, North America, Latin America as well. Some leaders have used populist rhetoric by strongly emphasizing the will of the people against established institutions. For example, Peronism in Argentina.
So
So,
it's I just want to
yeah,
remind me. So
yeah,
it's really the wrapping basically. So we
yeah,
don't have
yeah.
to assume that someone who does
That's
populism
right.
is ill-intended. Someone can
That's
use
right.
populism to actually really rally people around a common objective and actually make things changes for the best. And in some cases, some people can use the wrapping of populism to bring people towards a less positive
Unfortunately,
objective.
unfortunately, that's right. So populism is not a political system, since that's what we're talking about. It's a way of doing politics. So populists will often say, "I represent the real people," and with emphasis on the real here. And the elites have abandoned you. Can, populism can be a force of contestation within a democracy. It can also create tensions with democratic institutions if compromise becomes impossible. That's a real risk. So it's a way doing politics that opposes the people to the elites. It's not a complete ideology like socialism, capitalism. We can find populist movement on the left as well as the right. It can exist within a democracy, but can sometimes create tensions with institutions. And as you said, can lead to some kind of implosion of societies. Uh, so, uh, so the trap here with populism, if I may conclude on that, is immediate, politicizations and more polarization. So a political style, not a political systems, and I would, end the discussion with that.
Super. Because we mentioned a lot about democracy and what is a democracy. So basically, from what I understand, democracy is power to the people, right? We vote, we change our
Yeah.
leaders, we're unhappy. We go to the voting booth and we say we want to change. I kind of feel on the other end of the spectrum would be people don't have power. A small group or maybe just one individual has the power, which I guess would be anti-democratic systems. And we hear a lot of words. Are they all anti-democratic systems? Because we hear fascism, dictatorship, autocracy, oligarchy. So first of all, are they significantly different variation of anti-democratic system?
Yes, there are variations, but obviously they all have one thing in common, right? It's concentration of power at the top. So that's one thing they've in common. But then we can find some nuance between they are different concepts. Uh, yes, we can. They all prefer system situations in which power is more concentrated than in democracy. That's undeniable. Uh, it's a bit like, if I put it, let me give you an example. It's like a thermometer. The more power becomes concentrated, and the more institutions are weakened. The further we move away from, we move from a complete democracy. So we can imagine at normal temperature, you have a liberal democracy. As I said, free elections, solid institutions, for instance. When the temperature rises, then that's when it's not a political system, but that's when we can do this kind of us versus them. populism can appear. You know, um, it's like our small. We're starting to have flu. We're coughing. There's something that we're not feeling well. Temperature rise. So it's a political style that opposes the people to the elite. The fever continues to rise. Then we speak of illiberal tendencies, pressure on institutions, harsh rhetoric. Let's say that's I think I can safely say that's what we're seeing in the United States. But at some point, you get to fascism, it's not just a high fever. That's when the thermometer breaks completely. No more free elections, concentrated power, and crushed opposition. But there are different ways to get there. Uh, Maybe fascism. Start with fascism because that's one of Trump's favorite word, right? Uh, Fascism is a very specific political ideology. It is an authoritarian system. It rejects democracy, seeks to concentrate power around a strong leader and a highly centralized state, often in the name of the nation. So I said was Trump's one of Trump's favorite words was one of Trump's opponent's favorite word. I want to be clear about that. So historically, fascist regimes are also sought to mobilize all the society behind a big national project, and they have strongly repressed their position. Fascism it's a very specific ideology. It's not simply an authoritarian regime. So it goes beyond this us versus them. It's us as a people, literally, very often vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And other when it is us versus the rest of the world, and said, we need to combat the enemy within, which are they're considered as being traitors. Think about yes. Go
Is
ahead,
it
Jeff.
is it very different than a dictatorship? So basically,
Um,
is a fascist leader that different from a
Now,
dictatorship
well,
leader?
I would say uh, uh, fascism can express itself, I would say, mainly as a form of dictatorship, right? This message of this us versus them rejecting democracy and all that, you're going to find that, and you need very concentrated power. Dictatorship is a more general term, so it can take different forms. Uh, Simply a system in which, as I just said, dictatorship power is concentrated in the hands of one leader, a small group, or a small group where citizens cannot truly replace their leaders through free elections. So it's a key difference. Fascism is a particular form of dictatorship, but not all dictatorship are fascist. So you can have dictatorship without having this kind of a big national project, right? Only one vision.
It feels, from what I understand, it feels like fascism is maybe more aggressive
Yeah, I would say
than
yeah.
dictatorship.
Yeah, because you can have, as I said, you can have different forms of this dictatorship where power will be more dispersed. Think about autocracy. That's another term. I would say it's even broader here. When you talk about autocracy, it's a political system where real power is concentrated in the hands of a leader or small group, even if formal institutions such as elections or parliament may exist.
In an autocracy,
Authoritarian, yeah, in autocracy, you still have, you know, elections are in shambles, but they still exist. So an autocracy may sometimes hold elections, but those elections not always allow for genuine alternative power. I mean, we talk about, the Soviet election results, right? They had elections, but
they
the
win with
leader.
like 97% of the
That's
vote or
right.
something like
That's
that.
right. That's right. And now think about so there's another term that's different, but that's what we for many that's what more and more we observe in the United States. It's oligarchy. That's another term of concentrated power. In this case, an oligarchy is a system in which power is concentrated in the hands of a small group, very often defined by wealth or economic influence rather than an official political function. You know, So we talked about the oligarch as well. There was oligarchs, and in Russia, uh, we saw Putin was very aligned on the oligarch, and then when held in the power, he pushed them aside. It's interesting. The United States kind of see the reverse. Uh, Trump, in his first term, really ran anti the tech oligarchy. Then 1920 and especially 2024 elections, he ran very, very close to them. Right? As his inaugurations,
They were all
all
there. They
they
were
were
all in the
all
crowd,
there.
first
They were
row
all
almost.
there, and that's why Trump said it very well. He said, in my first term in 2016, they were all against me. No, they all want to be my friend.
Yeah, and their wealth
Uh,
exploded since.
exactly, because they say it's all in their interest, because Trump, in some ways, need them. They need Trump. Uh, with all the deregulations, free hands, or even attacking Canada for having the so-called Netflix tax is to them, to Trump, uh, those big tech industries are part of the government. So when some observers speak of oligarchy in the United States, they do not mean that the country has ceased to be a democracy. Means that very powerful economic actors, and I'm talk about the tech, but it goes beyond that. Uh, Large corporations, large fortunes exert an increasing influence over political decision.
Basically, money calls the shot.
Yeah, just like it was the case in the late 19th century, and then there was a backlash against that. So we'll see if history repeats itself or not. So, very simply, dictatorship describes mainly how power is concentrated, and autocracy describes a system where real power is the hands of the few. Fascism describes a very specific authoritarian ideology, and an oligarchy describes a concentration of power in a small group, often an economic group.
So
So,
so
yes,
from what I understand, fascism needs an enemy.
yeah, in some ways,
And
yeah.
dictatorship wouldn't necessarily need an enemy.
But dictatorship, I would say, very often can be vis-a-vis an outside enemy, but not always. So you can seize the power and then start to control more and more institutions until now. But it can be through a revolutions, through civil war. That's what we saw in China, for instance, under Mao Zedong. Different ways to get there. But fascists, it's really can be held by a certain segment of the society that represents the true citizens. That's what we saw in Italy, and obviously that's what we saw uh, in uh, in Germany. Um, and that's what some would say. I think I would refer again here to Tim Snyder, and Tim Snyder is not refraining talk about fascism in the United States. So
But we see it with ICE, we see it how he attacks people with
that's right,
autism, we
that's
see it how
right,
he attacks the LGBTQ community, we
yeah,
see it how he attacks journalists, how he
that's right, and more
just the
subdued.
numbers that we know, like just the official number that comes out of what happens in ICE detention center, and so that
Yeah,
just what we know is already pretty horrific, and I
no,
can't even imagine.
just being having a little darker skin kind of makes you the enemy of ICE and the Trump regime, right? So I'm a little bit more subdued than Tim Snyder, but Tim Snyder is much more of an expert on the matter than I am. For those who don't know, Snyder was a professor at Yale, basically highly critical of Trump, and then accepted lucrative offer to move to the University of Toronto, where he can speak more freely.
And be safer.
Yeah. So going back to a thermometer, we can imagine that the further we move from a democracy where power is broadly distributed, the closer we move towards systems where power is concentrated. So that's dictatorship, autocracy, oligarchy.
And
But each of
I
them,
I
yes,
will bring back to something very interesting you said a while back. You said, in democracy, power changes without violence.
that's right.
So, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, if people lose their democracy, the
Yeah.
only way to get it back is very sadly through violence. Historically, I'm
In
pretty sure
some
that's what the
ways, no,
history
but
books show.
yeah, violence or not, you can see the Soviet Union, there was some, collapse from within. Uh, and there was some hope with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and obviously, which led to all, a bunch of other countries under the boots of the Soviets, where we still had, true democracy, sometimes with violence, more often than violence, but not necessarily with violence either. So it's not just like, there's no one true recipe and say, well, here, now the way out is going to be through violence. Can be the case often, but no, uh, not necessarily all the time.
So, protect and cherish our democracies.
Absolutely,
That's what we should be doing, no matter
it's a
where you are.
yes, like we polish a very precious stone, and we need to constantly polish that precious stone. Don't We should never take anything for granted.
Perfect. Thank you. So I just want to recap the key aspects. So you mentioned democratic systems is who controls the power. Anytime I'm wrong, you can stop me.
Yeah,
Economic systems is how wealth is created and redistributed. And one mistake that people make, and that people more and more and more in the social discourse and all, is that we combine those two together. It's not the same. So you say it's two different axes, and to do a proper analysis, we need to do the analysis on the democratic system axis and on the economic system axis. We also saw that socialism is not scary. Socialism, the real definition of socialism is basically it might have more so intervention from the state to make sure that the wealth inequalities don't get out of hand, and that you invest basically in social systems. You mentioned education, you mentioned healthcare, unemployment benefits, retirement benefits. Communism, another big scary word that we hear, communism has it's been conceptualized and defined, has never existed in the last few hundred years.
that's
So
right.
some places might be labeled or might call themselves communists, but it's not what communism really is, because communism, by the definition, by the conceptualization of the term, means no social classes, no economical exploitation, and it's basically people have what they need, and it might lead eventually even to the state not being needed anymore
That's right.
because people have what they need. There's no wealth inequalities, and also for people who are scared of communism, no social classes, no economical exploitation, personally, sounds pretty neat. But then again, it's never been applied the way it's been conceptualized.
Yeah, and very importantly, it led to very, very strong state.
Which, by definition, it shouldn't.
That's right.
Because I said, by definition, eventually communism gets rid of the state because it doesn't need it anymore. But we see in systems that are calling themselves communism that the state is strong, which is the antithesis, basically, of what it should be. And so we mentioned also, so then you have democracies, which means free and fair election with institutions that are in place to counter the what are so you say three axes of democracy:
Yeah,
free and fair free and fair elections.
Free to choose in elections, different types of rights of
Protected
the
rights,
press,
Bill of
pro-
Rights,
protected rights, and kind of institutions. So this, some kind of a balance between different institutions.
and the rule of law. You actually mentioned rule
And
of
an
law, what we
important
mentioned.
rule of law, which means that rights don't only apply to citizens, but the laws also apply to the state apparatus as well.
So in a functioning democracy, no one is above the law.
That's right.
Even if you're the leader or if you're a deputy or if you're whatever important role that you have in the government, in a functioning democracy, no one is above the law.
That's right.
And then you have other side, the anti-democratic system, which basically concentrates the power in the hands of a few or in one figure, such as dictatorship, fascism. Oligarchy is what it means. Oligarchy is the people with the wealth basically
Usually,
pretty
yes.
much call the shots or have a
Yeah.
very strong influence on the decisions that are made. And I'm guessing to get more wealth and more power.
Obviously,
I'm pretty sure they don't
it's
put
rational.
pressure to redistribute that wealth. I'm pretty
No,
sure they
exactly.
want to have even more wealth.
Exactly. It's not saying, oh, we want to amass more wealth and then to redistribute all this wealth to the entire citizens. No, that's not what we've seen through examples towards the end of the war, so creating foundations and redistributing. But that's not the main goal.
Yeah, okay. So I think we covered pretty much. So then again, because the purpose is because politics either because there's this thing I see sometimes online that people say, well, I don't do politics. Well, my dear, politics is doing you because we're all influenced by what happens in politics, even though you're interested in it or you're not interested in it. And I think it's very important that people are better informed about what's happening, the different platforms, the different options, to make sure that they choose and they vote according to
Yeah.
what's important for them. And the objective of today's episode was to clarify and to be able to have a better informed discussion also as a society, as voters, and not get scared by boogeyman terms that are thrown around that are stickers that are applied to pretty much anything shiny. Words have meaning, and it's important.
Yeah, I think you said it so well. If I can, recap some ways uh, as well, maybe some concrete examples like Canada. You can say face it's a liberal democracy politically. We have free elections, independent institutions, and the market economy economically. So we have a democracy plus regulated capitalism. China, very different. It's not a liberal democracy. Power is concentrated in single party, but economically, however, China widely uses market, mechanism. There are private firms, competition, international investment. Maybe not the same extent as we have here, with a heavier hand in the economy. So we can have capitalist economy without democracy. We can have democracy with different degrees of state intervention in the economy. So obviously, we observe liberal democracies, often market economies, but that's not an absolute rule. It's like it's like cooking. You know, there no everybody has their own perfect recipe, right? To make a jambalaya, for instance. I like making jambalaya, so I'm going to use that. So we use different ingredients, typical that type of political regimes, the type of economic organization. More of this, less of that. Combination, can vary, and it changes over time, right? Uh, so understanding there are two distinct distinctions help us avoid many confusion, public debate. Um, so it's very important. I think you said it very well. I'm just trying to present it in a little different way.
Oh, it's perfect. And also, one of the objectives of the podcast is to tackle misinformation. And is there any aspect of your field of research that you hear people are getting wrong that you would like to correct that maybe we haven't covered so far?
And yeah, I think there are a few of them. Some, I think we have covered, most of them, but I might be repeating myself a little bit. I would say, the key point is mixing political system, economic system. There's confusions between both. We often hear that country is democratic because it is capitalist. That's not necessarily the case. Or that country is authoritarian because it is socialist. Doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Two different dimensions. A country can be capitalist without being democratic with different degrees of economic intervention. Second, I think I don't think we're going to say it often enough. It's the exaggerated use of political words. Second source of misinformation comes from those use of political words. In terms of fascism, socialism, communism, often used as insults rather than concepts. So the problem here is when we use these words without precision, we eventually lose the ability to understand what is really happening. So it's what I call the hammer argument. The more you repeat it, even if it's false, more and more people are going to believe it. Third, systems, they're not absolute. Most countries are mixtures. Um, for example, in almost all modern economies, we combine the markets and state and interventions. Fourth, and I think to me it's important, if I want to end on kind of an optimistic note, it's believing that, well, the die has been cast. All systems are not fixed. In reality, they evolve constantly. Democracies can strengthen or weaken. Economic systems transform over time. That's why, and again, I go back to this idea. We always need to be on our guard. I repeat it. I think that's a strong image that I want your listener to keep in mind. That democracy is a jewel that requires constant polishing. Be very, very aware of misinformations, which often begins when we oversimplify complex reality. And that's sometimes that's the essence of populism. It's oversimplifying some more complex reality. Now, there's some truth that there can be some discontent in the United States, right? And people losing their job through the
You have AI and mental
globalization,
layoffs, globalization
AI,
also.
globalizations on that, but that's linked to what we call structural adjustment. Some people will be made better, some worse, and all that, but it's going to feed. It's a way misinformation will feed all of that. So understanding the basic concepts in politics, economics, not only for academics like myself. That's what allows citizens to have more informed discussions. On a more, so if I can do more personally on that, uh, as a professor, when I see students understand these concepts very quickly when we take the time to explain them, but also when we take the time to discuss them. That's what I do with my students. And sometimes they come from different countries on that, and we're going to take one concept, one word, and we spend an entire, 3 hours discussing one concept of IR, read different point of views and having discussions about that. And that's when sometimes we may come out a little bit more confused, but very often we have more clarity as well. So that's why I'm extremely grateful again for your invitation.
Well,
Uh,
thank you.
that's not something that I could cover as I do often in a short media interview.
Perfect. And talking about your role as a professor and an academic, taking inspiration from the conclusion of a scientific article that opens the door for future research. What can we expect from you, Érick, as a researcher? What's next on your field? And also, if you can lead with that, with also any last word that you would like to tell our audience, I'd like to give the closing comments to my guests.
Yeah, if I can say something a bit more personally, so I'll officially retire my role as university professor in about a year from now, a bit over a year. And in my career, obviously, I have moved from being young scholars, wanted to change the world and trying to publish and the best journal article, best books, and all that. Uh, no, I'm still doing some research, a bit more relaxed, but in link to your podcast, uh, I really want to talk to everyone, to the citizens, and that's why among other things, I created my blog. I make myself more visible in the media, and I think we're living in some kind of dire times. Probably not the most dire of times in history of mankind, but I think it's important that I use all of my experience to communicate with everyone. I still have many projects. I'm not get through all of them, but maybe one of the most passionate about is what I call the two-level world. Uh, so for many years, we have analyzed international relations primarily through the lens of strategic rivalry between great powers. Mainly nowadays between United States and China. Now that's obviously fundamental, but I think it's no longer sufficient to explain how today's world works. So I've developed this model with a Chinese colleague and good friend of mine. Uh, we recognize that these interactions between great powers are important, but it's also that's what we're seeing is leaders from different countries, Canada or groups, countries like the European Union, Japan, Australia, they're trying to situate themselves vis-a-vis China and the United States. Obviously, we're very close to the United States. It could be a key concern for us. If you are the South Koreans, you have obviously have a bit more in mind the China. Both have relations, but there's also, and this is where, and that's closely related to Mark Carney's famous speech at Davos. It's acting collectively among these middle powers, so-called middle powers themselves. Um, so I think we're really faced with a long-term strategic rivalry between United States and China. But these countries that I've named, or you can say all the other countries in the world, are not condemned to choose one side or another. So we need more flexibility. Uh, so that's why I call the two-level wars in really a nutshell. So that connects directly to our discussion today. Geopolitical conflicts are never purely military diplomatic. They also involve competing political system, economic models, different ways of organizing society, which means that understanding the current or the future of geopolitics therefore require us to analyze both dimensions simultaneously. Balance of power among states, the political and economic system that seek to defend, adapt, or transform. So if you want to understand, country, you need to see how it functions internationally, but also it interacts with the rest of the world. So that's what among other things I want to develop. I would say more importantly, even after I retired, I want to be trying to be as much as I can. I don't know if that's uh, realistic, but can be a voice of reason and trying to communicate to citizens at large.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. For the audience, you can find the relevant links in the episode's description, such as Érick's blog. Thank you so much, Érick, for your time and your expertise, which have allowed us to learn stress-free about the various political and economic systems, helping us to better understand what the terms mean, which will help us as a society to have a better informed discussions on these topics. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. See you soon. I love you all. Thank you so much for listening to our whole episode. I hope you learned a lot and had as much fun as we did. If you want notifications for new episodes, you can subscribe to my channel on YouTube or on your favorite podcast streaming platform. You can also like, comment, share with your friends and family on top of subscribing. It's a great way to support the podcast free of charge, allowing me to bring you even more subjects to learn stress-free about. You may also join my Patreon and follow me on social medias to get news and teasers for upcoming episodes. All relevant links are in the description below. I'm curious, what have you learned in this episode or what surprised you? Leave us a comment and let's keep the conversation going. To conclude, a huge thank you to you, the listeners, and to our guests. You all make that podcast possible. See you soon for another episode of Learn Stress Free. Until then, keep learning. I'm your host, Jeff Rodrigue, signing out, wishing you the best. I love you all.